Well, if you're going to talk about the history of NAFB, you have to talk with Dix Harper. He's done it all, in and out of broadcasting, anything around broadcasting. He's helped with a lot of different careers, including his own, which is quite interesting and varied, and we're going to go back and look at that. Dix, good to see you.
Good to see you.
You were telling me your first NAFB convention was
47.
47.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Well, I had been working with Chuck Wooster that summer, and Chuck was running for office, I believe. I think that was the year he was elected vice president. And Chuck said, you ought to come to the convention. He said, I'll have a room for you. So I managed to, I think I took a train to Chicago from Iowa State. And I was so impressed. They were meeting, most of the meetings were in the lower tower at the old Stevens Hotel, and the upper towers where they ate and had their banquets. And I had so much fun and met so many interesting people, I called my wife and said, I'm going to stay another night. I'd only planned to stay one day. So that was my first convention. They were debating raising the dues from, I think it was $5 to $10, and there were a lot of guys opposed to that. And of course, a lot of people said the original Farm Broadcasters Organization, which was called RFD then, Radio Farm Directors, was really a social club that met during the International Livestock Show and the National 4-H Club Congress. And it was kind of that way, but eventually, 1956, when I was Secretary-Treasurer of the association, and John McDonald was the president, we incorporated the association in Nashville, Tennessee. And of course, as we changed names of the organization, the papers have had to be redone. We're still in Tennessee. And I understand yesterday we had to pass some resolutions because Tennessee requires a secretary. Well, are we going to have a secretary running again in the association?
We'll see. That's interesting how it does go back. Something we're dealing with now goes back to the originally Tennessee. Now, what was your first job in radio?
Oh, man. WOI at Iowa State. I went over looking for a typing job. I had the GI Bill and figured now if I could just get a typing job or something, because I'd done that before the war, milked cows and typed. and
we had strong fingers.
I went to the radio station figuring maybe they had some typing that be done, and the manager just laughed. He said, look, I've got grad students' wives coming out of my ears. They all want typing jobs. We talked a little bit, and he said, did you ever do acting? I said, well, yeah, high school, and I was in a couple of plays here in college before I went to service. I played Dexter and Kiss and Tell. He said, come in the studio. And he handed me a script. They have a children's serial. They used to run at 5:15 to 5:30. And they were doing Uncle Remus. And they were looking for somebody to be Uncle Remus. So I made up a voice. And that night at 5:15, I went on the air for the first time playing Uncle Remus in a children's serial. Now, that was not a paying job, but they soon found out that I was a major in ag education and I had certain ag economics courses. So Cap Bentley asked me to help out with the market news. And then by spring quarter, the news director said, you live here, don't you? Yeah. Well, you won't be going home then during spring vacation. I said, no. So you can do news. So I became a newsman. Then Dale Williams was the farm broadcaster, worked the extension service, and I began to help him. Pretty soon I was working 8 hours a day at the station and going to college too. Wow. By then they started paying me a whole 50 cents an hour. And then the next summer I was awarded the first WMT Farm Radio Scholarship by Chuck Wooster. So I went over to Cedar Rapids, worked with Chuck and Warren Kester, and trying to remember, Eddie Bowman was our weatherman. And we had a lot of learning experiences there. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I had been in the 4-H pig club business and had been a state champion and trip to Club Congress and whatnot. And Chuck sent me to interview a girl down in Ottumwa who was the first International Farm Youth Exchange. She had been in Pig Club, and they'd had a flood because the river at Ottumwa frequently floods, and their whole farm had been flooded, and her sow was about to farrow. So she put the sow in a rowboat and put the sow in the haymow, and the pigs were farrowed in the haymow. Well, we had to take they didn't have electricity on the farm, I remember that. She and her mother went with us into a drugstore in town where we could plug the recording equipment in.
Wow.
The engineer was with me. Of course, in those days, nothing was portable. We had huge recording equipment. Set it up, and I interviewed her, but in my interview, since it's the first one I'd ever done, we got to talking and comparing notes, and I talked about my experiences with Pig Club and hers, and got back, and Chuck listened to the tape. He said, "I can't use this." I said, "Why?" He says, "I sent you down there to interview her. You did, but you also interviewed yourself. So you go back and do it over." So I had arranged to get the engineer lined up again, call her and tell her we're going to have to go back into the drugstore again and do it over. And it was the same way with writing scripts. He asked me one day at a meeting, could I write the script for his morning program? Now, Chuck had a wonderful style. He got a lot of stories in, but they all were connected. He said, meanwhile, at State College and things like that, he just told a story. Well, I wrote a script, and man, I had 23 items in it. I thought it was just great. I left it on his desk. He came in just before I was ready to leave at 5 o'clock. He looked at it. He said, "You have listened to my program, haven't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "This is one item, another item, another item. I want you to go home and have supper and come back here and rewrite this and put it in my style."
Connect it all.
So I did. And that's the kind of learning experiences I had all that summer.
Wow.
Got sent out on trips and learned about what you do when you have a flat tire or the company car.
All those. And your career, though, what's so interesting is you didn't stay in broadcasting. You went to other agency work, things like that, then would come back to broadcasting. So you were kind of in and out, around it always, though. So you've seen all aspects of the business.
When I got ready to graduate, and I'd been 2.5 years at Iowa State and worked at WMT, I had job offers from all over. One of the ones that people thought I was crazy, I turned Herb Plambeck down, because Herb didn't offer me as much money to start as I was making already at Iowa State, at the college station. And I told him that. He was shocked. He said, "Well, I'm only making about $800 more than he offered me." And I said, "Well, Herb, you need a raise. You've been here since 1936. But I turned down Mason City, Iowa City, Des Moines, 2 stations in Cedar Rapids. I could have gone back to WMT and went to work in Kokomo, Indiana, because a brand new station was being built, CBS station, and it sounded like a lot of fun. So we went over there and really helped finish up building the station. But I also had time then to go to Purdue and get acquainted with everybody over there that I needed to get acquainted with. I had time to go to wheat field days, meet with a lot of the farmers in the various counties we were going to cover, and the county agents. And by the time we went on the air, July 16th, 1948, I was pretty well connected in the community. And I had 2 programs start out, Dix Harper's Indiana Farm Journal of the Air for an hour in the morning, and a 30-minute program, since our callers were WIOU, IOU Farm Service. And when the announcer would say, "Now it's 12:15, time for Dix Harper to say," and that was my introduction, IOU Farm Service. Then we did a half-hour program.
Tell me about your days in Chicago.
Well, I got to Chicago after I went to 3 years in Kokomo, 2 years in Indianapolis, WIBC, and WLS called me, and I went up to Chicago and went to work for WLS. And in 1956, I got a phone call from a guy named Earl Hodgson, who was president of the advertising agency for International Harvester. I was sponsored 6 days a week by Oliver. And he said, I need to talk to you about this International Harvester business. I said, yeah, I know we've got a contract in, and Bill Mason is going to handle that because I'm on the air for Oliver. He says, no, I want to talk to you. Well, I was secretary-treasurer of the association at the time, had all the books, knew who the people were. And he said, we're trying to decide which people to put on the contracts around here. So I went down to go to talk to him, took all the books with me. He never wanted to look at the books. He wanted to talk to me about coming in and handling it. So that was the way the broadcast department got started at Aubrey, Findlay, Miley, and Hodgson, which Jim Evans used to call Aubrey finally made a horse blanket. Anyway, soon I had PAG and Murphy Products Company and FS, which was then Illinois Farm Supply, Berg Barn Cleaners. Can you imagine a radio commercial for Berg Barn Cleaners?
I can't, man.
Oh, we did. And I had a 7-man department. Jim Evans was one of them. And we had International Harvester on the air with as many as 135 farm broadcasters around the country. And
Tell me about the barn dance.
oh, the barn dance. Well, my job on the barn dance usually was do the station breaks on Saturday night from the studio. But once in a while, they'd have somebody ag-related at the barn dance as a guest. And so I would get to go down to the stage, work with them. But mostly my work was on Saturday night with the old National Barn Dance. And that went on until 59. I left WLS in 56 to go in the agency business. But in 59, ABC decided to drop the farm and the barn dance and go to rock and roll.
A big part of my career has been with the farm, working, covering the Farm Progress Show as a broadcaster.
Yep.
I've been to a lot of them.
Well, I was
but you really, a lot of people don't realize, you had a lot to do with the formation of the Farm Progress Show.
At Indianapolis, I had been national corn picking contest chairman and put on state contests a couple of years, and then we had the national. A project that Chuck Wooster started in Iowa, 49 I think it was. And we had a very successful run with the national corn picking contest. We had entries all the way from South Dakota to Pennsylvania, and north and south too, Kentucky and Tennessee. And I got a call from WLS from George Bigger, whom I had known before. He's kind of, well, he's in the Hall of Fame now. And George said he had a job for me. I said, yeah, I remember back when I was in college you had a job for me, but it didn't pay enough to live in Chicago. No, this is the best job around. So I went up and I became farm news director at WLS. But also, I found out why I was there. Because George came in one day and said, Mr. Well, the president of the company is having a meeting down in his conference room, and I want you there. Well, I was one of the 8 people that sat around that table and came up with the idea of the Farm Progress Show.
Wow.
And what they wanted was something to compete with the corn picking contest, because WGN had taken that on for Illinois, because WLS had turned me down when I was looking for somebody to take Illinois, because I would not let them have Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana. They wanted all 4 states. Well, those other 3 were all taken. So WGN took it. And they put on the corn picking contest down in Bloomington that year. Did very well.
And the Farm Progress Show's done very well.
Well, it sure has, but it has grown. The first year, we had a lot of the equipment and all that stuff, but we also had a firefighting demonstration. We burned a building. We had sheepdog trials. We had square dancing at that evening on the tennis courts over in Danville, all near Armstrong.
Armstrong, that's right.
Armstrong, Illinois.
Now, a lot of things have you worked in agencies and in and out, but when I got to know you, you were involved with Ray Wilkinson and Ken Tanner in North Carolina. Tell me about working with those guys at that network.
Well, that was a good experience because Ray was such a funny guy.
Very.
And he didn't tell me. I mean, he had a heart attack. And I was publishing magazines at the time. And he called me and he said, I need help. He said, how about having lunch with me? And I said, are you at the hospital? Oh, they've let me go back to work 4 hours a day. And I said, okay, we'll have lunch. So we had lunch. Well, he offered me a job, and I left the publishing business and went back into broadcasting. And it was a lot of fun because here's Ken, who really was a sports broadcaster, but had worked as a farm director in Greenville station down there before Ray hired him. He started out as a kid in high school working in Roanoke, Virginia, his hometown. And then Ray and Ken and I would put on the TV shows morning and noon, and we had radio. We had many networks. We had the swine network, we had the soybean network, the tobacco network, and cotton network, and I did the swine network. And Ray did tobacco and peanuts. And Ken did, I believe, soybeans and cotton. And we would tape. We had stations all over from Florida and Alabama, North Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, in the coastal plain area, you might say, because that's where most crops were. Yeah.
Good times.
Oh, man.
How many radio stations have you worked for in your career? Have you ever added them up?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've worked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the first career, and then radio, TV in Raleigh, and then we had 29 stations I fed live at noon every day. I don't know.
You're a past president. You were a historian for a long time. You're a Hall of Famer. The Meritorious Service Award is named after you.
Yeah, that was. I told John.
And you even won the Meritorious Service Award before they named it
after
you.
Well, way back in '59, I told John Vasatek last night, even though he was kind of speechless at first, but he did a fine job. I said, you made a much better speech than I did back in '59, because I was so shocked when my name was called, and on the way back after I'd been up at the podium and they'd presented me the plaque, my wife says, that was not your best speech.
always the toughest critic is your wife. You've done it all in this business. You've seen almost all the history of this organization. What has NAFB meant to you?
Oh, boy. Opportunity to meet so many wonderful people and to serve them. That was the idea of service. At one time I thought about becoming a pastor. And a pastor advised me against that. And he said, don't do it unless you absolutely have to. He was not a real happy pastor at the time. He had been, shall I say, demoted. Had taken him out of a big church in Des Moines and moved him out to a country church, and he was not happy. But anyway, I was engaged to his daughter at the time. Then I thought about, and I was trained to be a teacher, ag teacher. But I got into radio while I was doing that. And of course, I had also been a farm manager back. I was labeled the youngest farm manager in the United States when I was 17, because I went to work for the Vice President Montgomery Ward to build a hog herd for him. And we had a Duroc herd that did very well. We had the premier herd at Wisconsin State Fair and Grand Champion South, and had a couple of sales while I worked for him. Then I made the mistake of saving $185 and buying a 1932 Ford, and so I thought, I can go to college now.
Wow. What stands out to you? I mean, you've talked to so many people, you've interviewed so many, I'm sure, big names as well as, people that you maybe, you know, the kids and so many people along the way. You've covered events. Anything really stand out to you? A big event, a big interview, anything in particular?
Yeah.
What's that?
Miss America 1949.
Hard to forget that, yeah.
She was at the 4-H Club Congress, sponsored by Firestone. And it was revealed there that she had been a 4-H girl. Well, I wanted to interview her, and I didn't have the equipment, but WJR always had a mobile unit set up outside the hotel. They let me use their equipment, cut the big old platter, and the Firestone guy who was her chaperone, and Miss America, Jackie Mercer, and my wife all went down this thing, and I got Jackie in there, and she talked about, she was from Arizona, from Goodyear, or Goodrich, or whatever it is, just outside of Phoenix a little ways. Her dad was superintendent of the schools there. She had won the Arizona contest. The JCs didn't have enough money to buy her gowns and everything, so she made gowns that she wore in the contest as a 4-H project. She chopped cotton to raise money to go to Atlantic City.
Wow.
And Jackie was not very tall. She was about 5 or 5'1", I think. Anyway, she had quite a story, and I knew I was getting it when I looked up, and my wife, the Firestone guy, and the engineer all had tears streaming down their cheeks. I knew I had a tape, or a disc. WKY Oklahoma City asked to borrow it first. Then it went to CBS Network, and then Voice of America. It was used all over. And my saddest moment, maybe, was when we got a flood and ruined that disc, that platter. Because we were gone. 2 weeks later, I came back, it was covered with mold, and then I didn't know how to clean it off.
Well, you have to be amazed at the technology changes you've seen over the years.
My first tape recorder was a brush. It was a big box. Weighed 85 pounds. Portable.
Portable, yeah.
I can remember walking up on a porch of a place in Peru, Indiana, to interview a guy who was raising a new kind of walnut. And he had a Great Dane. I didn't know that. I rang the doorbell, the door opened, and out came the Great Dane, and I'm carrying this tape recorder. And me and the tape recorder and the Great Dane all hit the porch. And then there have been the visits with the presidents, all the way
How
from...
many?
Oh, I was thinking of that the other day, and forgot some. Ronald Reagan, I knew before he ever went to Hollywood. He was a sports reporter at WHO,
Right.
known as Dutch. And I saw him in his crystal studio at the State Fairgrounds recreate a Chicago Cubs baseball game, reading a ticker tape and with sound effects. Mm-hmm. And then there was Harry Truman. And Harry Truman, a lot of us made the same mistake. We all went to Governor Dewey's farm at Paulding, New York. In fact, half of NAFB, I think, was there. And we had a great time. They showed us around. And Dewey tried to impress us, but he made several mistakes. I think the worst one was he wore Adler elevator shoes because he was short. And you didn't wear them around a cow barn, but that's what he was doing. And we had a great day there. Evelyn McDonald showed up, and that was the first woman that had been there, and she made a speech about how bad the schools were in eastern Tennessee and the mountains. When she got through, Governor Dewey turned to John McDonald and said, "John, can I borrow her to take her with me on my campaign train?" But anyway, at the same time we were up there, Herb Planbeck had the plowing matches in Iowa, and Harry Truman gave his famous Give 'em Hell speech. And that night, after I got back from Paulding, New York, my dad called me, and he'd been there. He said, "You went to the wrong candidate." I said, "Why?" He said, "This guy Truman really made a speech." Well, I didn't know how close it was until I was working on the election returns that night. And at midnight, they told me I better go home and get some sleep before I signed on again at 5 o'clock, or 5:30. when I got back for my program the next morning, we were still doing election returns. We did them right through my program. Yeah. It was about 7:15, I think, before we finally decided Harry Truman had beat Dewey.
Wow.
And then Truman came to Kokomo, and we had our WIOU microphone up on the back of the train where he was making his speech. And afterward, he got off and he was shaking hands. There were no Secret Service people around in those days for the candidates. And they were all around the back of the train. All of a sudden, the train started to back up slowly. And Truman personally was pushing people out of the tracks. Get away, back! They're backing the train up. Well, the next year, I was at the White House. Brannon introduced us as who we were and where we were from. And when he got to me, Truman says, WIOU. That's where we almost backed over the people with the train.
He remembered.
Oh, yeah. And then the next year we had, he was talking about the squirrels on the White House lawn, and he was talking about the letter he had written to a music critic because he didn't find favor with his daughter.
Right.
And he said, Jack Jackson, he said, Jack, you're from Texas. Did you ever drive a span of mules? And Jack said, no, sir, I've driven a team, but not a span. Truman says, well, I have, but I know the language.
Served him well, dealing with those in Washington, I guess, over the years.
I think the last one I really got acquainted with was George Bush, H.W. Bush, because I had him here at the convention that year.
That's right. We need to wrap it up.
Oh, I know.
The stories can go on and on.
Oh, yeah.
But thank you. You've touched a lot of careers, including mine, and helped so many of us. Thank you so much, Dix.
Well, thank you.
Take care.
It's been real fun.
Dix Harper, Hall of Famer, NAFB.